Thank you for joining us for our midweek study. Continuing on through the 15th chapter of Matthew, what we're going to see here is that right after Jesus deals with the Canaanite woman and right after he sees her faith, after engaging in what is a kind of a borderline insult in comparing her to a dog, seeing her responsive faith and understanding, all the cultural and theological implications of what he was saying there, Jesus is impressed by her faith, and it says Jesus in verse 29 of chapter 15, Jesus went from there and walked beside the Sea of Galilee, and he went up on the mountain and sat down there, and great crowds came to him, bringing with them the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others. And they put him at his feet, and he healed them, so that the crowd wondered when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled healthy, and the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. Now, it's interesting here that we have this ending that it's kind of, obviously the Bible wasn't written in these chunks that we have them in now, where we have these little headings on them and verses and chapters and all that stuff. But this is really kind of the ending of a little section, a little snippet, a pericope, if you will. What happens here is that when it says they glorified the God of Israel, it's important for us to see that there's going to be there's a continuation here of Jesus' ministry. Remember, he's left the area where the Israelites were. He's gone up to this Tyre and Sidon, and he's actually making his way to this place called the Decapolis. And so this little snippet that we have here of Jesus healing the people is right between Tyre and Sidon and the Decapolis. Now, it's going to be important for us to understand this because both of these areas are Gentile areas, and Jesus is doing this healing in between. And geographically speaking, he's not far away from there, which would lead us to believe that Jesus is healing a lot of people that are from the area. And so it's fascinating to see that Jesus' ministry, he says, is he's not going to be able to do things for the Gentiles. He tells the woman, the Canaanite woman, hey, I can't help you out here because I can't give to the dogs what's meant for the children. And yet her faith is the reason that he relents and blesses her. We see that this blessing doesn't end with her, but this blessing will continue on down through the next section that we will cover here and the section that we're dealing with right now. So how do we understand this? Well, it's important for us as we look at this to understand the issue of healing and what healing means. And one of the things that's fascinating to us is that it says Jesus went from there. If we read this again, Jesus went from there and he walked beside the Sea of Galilee, and he went up to the mountain and sat down there. So he's going up to this mountain. And remember, when you go up to a mountain, you're getting closer to God from a symbolic standpoint. And the mountain was the place of giving sacrifices and doing sacrifices. The mountain was the place where you went up and you worshiped God. It was the place where the temple was. The altars were kind of miniature symbolic mountains. So it's important to keep that context in mind. That little detail is told to us for a reason. And in verse 30 it says, and great crowds came to him, bringing with them the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, many others, and they put them at his feet, and he healed them, so that the crowd wondered when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled healthy, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified God in Israel, or glorified the God of Israel. So how do we understand what healing is? A lot of times when Jesus heals, we're not told this specifically in this passage, but in a lot of areas where we're told that Jesus heals, a number of things happen. We're always kind of given a place in relationship to Jesus. Either Jesus gives a word, and that sometimes happens, but often Jesus either touches somebody, lays hands on them, or sometimes they lay hands on him, or here we're told that they're put by or at his feet. It's interesting that when we see these healings, a lot of times they're connected to Jesus physically in some way, and we want to understand why that is. And to understand that, we have to understand what this issue of touching, and especially the laying on of hands, has to do. Now, again, we're not told specifically in this passage that hands are laid on, but this happens a lot with Jesus in his healing, and here, once again, we are told that there's a connection to Jesus bodily. They're placed at his feet. So let's understand this. Leviticus chapter 16, verse 20 says, "And when he has made an end of atoning for the holy place and the tent of meeting and the altar, he shall present the live goat. And Aaron shall lay both of his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel and all their transgressions, all their sins. And he shall put them on the head of the goat and send it away into the wilderness by the hand of the man who is in readiness. The goat shall bear all their iniquities on itself to a remote area, and he shall let the goat go free in the wilderness." So what's the deal here? Well, when you give a sacrifice, when you go to the temple and you give a sacrifice, and remember Jesus here goes up to the mountain, there's a connection. What takes place is that there has to be, there needs to be a connection between you and the thing that you're sacrificing. That this is really important for us to grasp. That when you offered a sacrifice, you were actually doing something that was much bigger than just, oh, this is the cost of an animal. The sacrifice wasn't just the cost of whatever animal you brought. So there was a system. There was 5 clean animals that you could sacrifice. And they ranged all the way from a bird that would be cheap to a cow that would be expensive, a bull. And the issue was, well, if you were poor, you could buy the cheap animal, and if you were wealthy, you could buy a more expensive animal. If you were in leadership, then you were going to have to do one of the more expensive animals, usually the bull, for the leaders. So there is a cost element involved, that this is going to cost you some money, but that's not really where we should see the issue of sacrifice here. The issue was that, as it says here, Aaron, in verse 21 of Leviticus 16, "Aaron shall lay both of his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel." What he's doing is, the goat actually represents the people. So when you give a sacrifice, this is in Leviticus 16 talking about the Day of Atonement, which they had one goat that was sacrificed and killed, one goat that was sent off into the desert. But if the procedure is similar for any kind of sacrifice. When you're giving a sacrifice, you put your hands on the animal, and there's a connection between you and the animal. There's a unity that's being created through that touch, where this animal is taking on from you the sin that you have. And so the animal is being sacrificed, but it's really, the animal represents you. You're the one who should be being sacrificed, but the animal is being sacrificed in your place. That's what's happening. So it's not the monetary expense of the animal being sacrificed, it's the identity of the animal being sacrificed as he represents you and stands for you, and that transference of identity occurs in the touching of the animal. Now, why are we saying that this is important? Well, because as Jesus heals, again, there's this connection to Jesus' body and the people who are experiencing the healing. So Chapter 8, verse 14 says, "And when Jesus entered Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick with fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she rose and began to serve him. That evening they brought to him many who were oppressed by demons, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick." This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. "He took our illnesses and bore our diseases." So Jesus is bearing the diseases and the illnesses of the people, just as the sacrificial animal bears the sins of the people. And that's a really fascinating thing. The other thing it's fascinating about this is that this interpretation of Isaiah, "He took our illnesses and bore our diseases." If we go to Isaiah and we look at chapter 53, we're going to start in verse 3, although this phrase, "He took our illnesses and bore our diseases," is from verse 4. We're actually going to read verse 3 through 5 just to get the context. But notice something interesting about this. Verse 3 of Isaiah 53 says, "He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Now here's verse 4, the important verse. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. So this passage in Isaiah 53 is all about this guy of sorrows who's basically going to bear our griefs and our sorrows. He's going to be pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities, and through his chastisement we're going to be healed. He's going to bear our sins. He's going to, like the sacrifices of the Old Testament, he's going to bear our sins and our iniquities. Now, the interesting thing about this is in verse 4 when it says, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. This is what is interpreted in the Matthew passage that we read earlier as he took our illnesses and bore our diseases. So griefs and sorrows are illnesses and diseases. So what we're seeing here is that the bearing that Jesus is doing is a much more comprehensive bearing than we often think about. It might not be surprising to you if you've been a Christian for a while that Jesus bears our sins and he takes them to the cross, and he's associated with the Old Testament sacrifices through this. But it might be surprising to you that the other things that he bears is he bears our illnesses, our diseases, our griefs, and our sorrows. What are we to make of that? That's a very comprehensive thing to think about. And all this, again, has to do with the image of touch. Now, Jesus doesn't always touch people when he heals. He doesn't need to. But the fact that it often happens, we're to associate this healing of Jesus with the bearing of iniquities and the bearing of sins by the sacrifice. So what are we to make of the comprehensive nature of this bearing that Jesus does? Well, it's quite fascinating. I think one of the things that we have to understand is that sin is a bigger concept than we often think. We will often think about sin as moral failings, and that is probably the most natural way of thinking about sin. But sin is actually a bigger, more comprehensive concept than that. Sin has to do with missing the mark or going outside of the boundaries. It's really what sin is a lack of perfection. And so in our lives, we often kind of draw these interesting boundaries between kind of our sorrows and our illnesses and our moral failings. We say, well, this thing is sin and these things are just, bad luck or something else. But that's not the way the Bible sees it. The Bible sees all of this as imperfection. And that's why the fascinating thing is when we talk about Jesus removing our moral failings and us going to heaven, and then we talk about in heaven there's no sorrow, there's none of the stuff that we normally associate with kind of just a rough life. That every tear will be wiped away, all those things that we associate with heaven. We often see that as two things that are unrelated. Well, Jesus takes care of our sins, and then in heaven there's none of this sorrow or anything like that. We shouldn't really see that as two unrelated things. If Jesus takes care of the sins, and those sins are imperfections as well as moral failings, we can say there's a broader category of imperfection in our life, but then obviously, if Jesus has borne all those things away, then they will not be there in heaven, and we will have a life that is free from those things. The imperfections will be gone. And it's important for us to understand that it's not wrong to have a category called, sin is moral failing, sin is, imperfection. It's not wrong to have those categories, but we should also understand in our mind that there's also a connection between those things. And that connection is that there is a relationship between my moral failings and the sorrows that I experience. There is a connection between even the fact of illness and sin. Now, sometimes sin is directly related to our illness. Sometimes our illnesses come from the fact that we have sinned, and sometimes sin repeatedly and made a habit of sin. I think that there's certain mental illnesses that are the result of habitual ways of thinking that are very destructive. And when those things become ingrained and become habits, sometimes they reach the level of mental illness. I'm not saying that's always true. Sometimes you have, different things that have happened to somebody, head injuries or times when they have chemical imbalances, whatever. So it's not always true. But however, I think that it is sometimes true that these things come from our sinfulness. It could also be that, I might have an addiction to food, and that might lead to some illness in my life. I might have an addiction to alcohol that can bring illness in my life. There's a lot of things in our lives that can bring about physical maladies and addictions, and destructive behaviors can lead to illness. But there's a bigger conceptual framework than that even. And that is that man is to have dominion and mastery over the world. And our lack of dominion and mastery has in its roots and at its core sinfulness. We don't have the mastery over the world that we should have. We're not the people who we should be because of sin. And so some of these things we could also say, even if there's not a particular action that I'm experiencing that's leading to an illness or sorrow or something like that, sometimes we could say, well, the fact that human beings are less than they should be is responsible for the fact that we don't have the power over our world that we should. Therefore, we cannot prevent or correct some of the things that would be preventable or correctable. Now, we have to be really careful when we look at it this way and understand that there are limits, and we shouldn't fall into the trap of just, anytime somebody's experiencing a sorrow, grief in their life, or an illness in their life, that we just go, oh, well, it's because you're a sinful person. No, it's more of a collectively we're sinful people, and so we haven't mastered all we should have in this life. So in all these ways, what we see here is that Jesus is bearing all of the imperfections of existence, and Jesus is doing that in a way that is not just limited to the Jewish people, but is going to be extended to others as well. Well, thanks for joining us today. We hope to see you next time.